From the unexplained to the mundane, come join us on a journey to the fringe. Hello and welcome to Journey to the Fringe, where 1 times 1 has not yet been discussed, much to the dismay of Terrence Howard. At the recording of this episode, fairly topical joke, so maybe 1 or 2 of you will get it. The rest of you can look up who Terrence Howard is, what the hell that is. We are your podcast hosts, Taylor and Chelsea, here today to give you a background on the cultural phenomenon that is gray aliens, the history of it, and just an overall synopsis of why it is that we are talking about grays, or for the most part, when we say picture an alien, that we're all going to have the same idea in our mind.
Oh, I'm excited about this.
Chelsea, surprisingly, we're going to start well before the idea of grays in this episode, and I'm talking well before the start of that. But are you ready for it?
Give me a second. I'm ready about the grays.
Okay, perfect. And I just want to start first and foremost so that I want to make sure we're all picturing the same thing. So grays are typically depicted the main alien that people talk about. As soon as you say, close your eyes, think of an alien, this is what you're going to see.
Oh, yeah.
A gray-skinned humanoid who's missing parts such as noses, ears, or sex organs, just basically anatomically incorrect plush doll like that. And their bodies are usually depicted as being elongated, having small chest, lacking muscular definition and visible skeletal structure. And their legs are depicted as being shorter and jointed differently than humans, with limbs proportionally different from a human. Grays are also depicted as having unusually large heads in proportion to their bodies, with no hair on their body, and no noticeable outer ears or noses, sometimes with small openings or orifice for ears and nostrils. So that is
large black eyes, right? Did you say that?
Large black eyes, almond shaped.
Large black eyes, and I think they are spotted as being both short and tall.
Yes, and that might come up a little later. But for the most part, we're going to talk large head, no real features on the face other than the large eyes and maybe slits for noses and mouths.
And can I put here, or will it come up? A lot of people would say that they're like androids.
That's not going to come up at all, just so you know, because I'm trying to keep it of just where this idea comes from and not people's beliefs in what they are.
Okay. Well, then I just put it out there for your consumption, whether or not you accept it as.
Sure. Why not? Chelsea, where do you think I'm going to start this episode?
I'm going to go with, like, creation.
Okay. A little far. I'm, in fact, going to start it.
Too far. I thought you were going to say
far.
Not far enough.
Yeah, not far enough. No, too far, at least as far as I'm concerned. We're just going to start this episode in ancient Greece, where we're going to talk about the idea of aliens in themselves, and the fact that we really...
That's where it comes from?
No, we didn't believe in aliens at that time. So I'm just saying that this is like... And sorry, we are taking out of this... There are theories that there are ancient peoples who believed in alien visitation, Hopi Indians or Hopi indigenous peoples in Southwest US. That could be an episode in itself. They have supposedly in their rich history alien visitation, as well as cave drawings that may or may not depict gray-like beings. We're not going to be talking about those. We're going to be talking about kind of a European look at belief in extraterrestrial life. So Greeks believed, and this is coming straight from Aristotle, didn't write anything down, so he had to have his students write down his stuff. Or sorry, I get him backwards. He might have written things down. Anyhow, he believed the Earth was the innermost sphere in a universe or world surrounded by various other spheres containing the moon, sun, planet, and stars. Those heavenly spheres, crystalline and transparent, rotated about the earthly core comprising 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth.
I like that concept.
Yeah, and it makes for better TV than our normal lives anyways, when people can harness those. Those elements layered themselves on the basis of their essence or nature, as Earth's natural place was at the middle of the cosmos, which was why solid matter fell to the ground, seeking the inaccessible center far below. On the basis of this principle, Aristotle decided that it was an impossibility for other worlds and life to exist. If some other world existed, its matter would seek both the center of its world and of our world as well, and such opposite imperatives posed a logical contradiction in his mind. And he also applied further reasoning to point out that there is no space outside the known world for any other world to occupy. So, Aristotle concludes 2 worlds cannot both exist. It is just our world, and therefore there's nothing living outside it. There was apparently some pushback or some debate on this, and some Greeks disagreed with Aristotle's interpretation. Hey, but guess what? Of like the 4 Greek people's names you know, Aristotle's one of them, so guess what we believe for the most part going forward. Aristotle.
Yeah, there's only a handful of Greek people that I would know to name.
And they're probably all in a direct line around Aristotle. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. They're all like a direct line of each other.
And Zeus is Greek too, right?
Well, he's a god, so he might not have existed.
Huh.
Sorry, spoiler there on 4,000-year-old mythology. I can go back and edit in a spoiler alert so people can jump ahead. Don't worry. Anyhow, because Aristotle said this kind of carries forward all the way into medieval Europe. By the 13th century, Aristotle's writings had been rediscovered in medieval Europe for the Renaissance, and most scholars defended his position. And in fact, in 1277, the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier, he banned scholars from teaching over 219 principles, many associated with Aristotle's philosophy. And among the prohibited teachings on this list was item 34, that God could not create as many worlds as he wanted to. And since the penalty for violating this decree was excommunication from the church, Parisian scholars suddenly discovered rationales allowing multiple worlds, empowering God to defy Aristotle's logic. And since Paris was the intellectual capital of the European world, scholars elsewhere followed the Parisian lead. So from here, while several philosophers asserted God could make many worlds, most intimated that he probably wouldn't have bothered. And hardly anyone addressed the likelihood of alien life, although there are two, Jean Buridan in Paris and William of Ockham in Oxford, considered the possibility. Here's a quote from them. God could produce an infinite number of individuals of the same kind as those that now exist, but he is not limited to producing them in this world. End quote. Populated worlds showed up more prominently in writings by the renegade thinkers Nicholas of Cusa from 1401 to 1464 and Giordano Bruno 1548 to 1600. They argued not only for the existence of other worlds, but also for worlds inhabited by beings just like or maybe better than Earth's humans.
No.
Yeah. And you got to realize this is all happening pre-Darwin. So the idea of evolution, and particularly things happening in different natural environments, wouldn't be an idea that people would contemplate. So if they're thinking of God creating beings on another planet, it's just going to be humans. So if anybody at this point thinks there's extraterrestrial life, they're literally just thinking humans or smarter humans.
Okay. But it doesn't sound like anybody's thinking that.
Well, these two are, Bruno and Cusa.
Right.
Here's a quote from Nicholas of Cusa. In every region, inhabitants of diverse nobility of nature proceed from God, wrote Nicholas, who argued that space had no center and therefore the earth could not be central or privileged with respect to life. Bruno, an Italian friar, asserted that God's perfection demanded an infinity of worlds and beings. Well, infinite perfection is far better presented in innumerable individuals than in those which are numbered and finite. End quote. Bruno averred. Burned at the stake for his heretical beliefs, though, Bruno did not live to see the triumph of Copernicus during the 17th century. During that time, there were some people who believed it, but it's all from a religious standpoint, and again, no idea of evolution. So everybody just thinks about it the same way as other people on different planets, if they do exist. Then, of course, Copernicus comes along, says that, hey, maybe Earth isn't the center of the universe, shakes everything up a little bit.
It's scary.
Eventually, the idea of other worlds became no longer speculation, but astronomical fact, inviting the notion of otherworldly populations as the prominent Dutch scientist Christian Huygens pointed out in the late 1600s that, quote, a man that is of Copernicus's opinion that the Earth of ours is a planet like the rest of the planets cannot but sometimes think that it's not improbable that the rest of the planets have their inhabitants too, end quote. This is kind of a move from, you got to remember, we've known about planets for a long time. Venus, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus a bit. So these are the planets they're talking about. If we're just like those other planets, then hey, they have inhabitants too. And that's kind of the shift that happens in the 1600s. But again, still under the Christian idea of divine intervention is what creates life. They're going to be humans.
Yeah. Did you say what year this is?
This is in the 1600s.
1600s. Okay.
I'm going to continue on his quote here. It would be very strange that Earth was as populated as it is and the other planets weren't at all. This is just kind of becoming the belief as everything's moving. Although they didn't think people could live on the sun, they did side with those who envisioned inhabitants on other planets and even the moon. Again, continuing quote, just as there have been and still are a prodigious number of men foolish enough to worship the moon, there are people on the moon who worship the earth, end quote. From early modern times onward,
Love that.
discussion of aliens was not confined to science and philosophy. They also appeared in various works of fiction, providing plot devices that remain popular to the present day. Often authors used aliens as stand-ins for evil humans to comment on current events.
I wonder how that would go. Like
What
what
do you
the
mean?
speculation would be on the portraying them as evil too.
Yeah, and unfortunately I couldn't find any direct quotes on kind of like how they were portrayed at that time. Where I start things off are in the 1800s with writings. This really hits a head in the late 1800s when speculation about life on Mars increases following telescopic observation of apparent canals on Mars, which end up being an optical illusion. But despite this, 1895, there's an astronomer by the name of Percival Lowell,
Oh, nice name.
and he publishes his book Mars followed by Mars and its Canals in 1906, and this is him proposing that canals were the works of a long gone civilization. Now it should be noted spectroscopic analysis of the Mars atmosphere began in earnest in 1894 when US astronomer William Wallace Campbell showed that neither water nor oxygen was present in the Mars atmosphere,
How would they know that?
basically because you can see from the reflection of light.
Okay.
We know what colors and what you should see from different atmospheres coming off them, and what is present isn't oxygen.
Okay.
And by 1909, better telescopes and the best perihelic opposition of Mars since 1877 conclusively put an end to the idea of canals on Mars. But around this time, too, there was an idea going around Western civilization called spontaneous generation, which basically says if life can exist, it will exist, and it'll just spontaneously occur. So it was kind of assumed that everywhere there could be life, there is life. This theory was disproved in the 19th century by Louis Pasteur, who,
Really?
famous for the pasteurization, which we use for milk. But yeah, up until he came along, it was absolutely common knowledge that life can just spring up out of nowhere. And so when
And it can't.
we can get a little weird with it, especially with the idea of panspermia, because basically that means that life does have to come from nowhere at some point.
Oh no. I'm thinking too hard about this.
Okay. But just because Pasteur disproved it didn't mean that people still didn't believe in spontaneous generation and that life could pop up. And it's very common knowledge at this time there are aliens on Mars.
This time being today, right? Because I believe that.
Okay. It still does exist. Yeah, that idea.
But so what's the theory if it's not the theory that like life can create itself then?
Well,
You need something.
the idea of panspermia is in absolutely the right circumstances. There are the genetic building blocks of life in many parts of the universe that, when submitted to the right situation, can give rise to life. But basically,
It would have to be.
Yeah, but it's only in the right circumstances that it would pop up. Whereas the idea of
The
spontaneous generation is it's just
Everything needs to
everything
be correct.
everywhere is becoming life.
Okay, which yeah, okay, I'll agree with that. The conditions need to be right, but I was
Absolutely
like,
perfect,
how else
yeah.
are you gonna get life if you can't create something out of nothing somehow? Okay,
And for the most part, popular belief in alien civilization somewhere in our solar system remained strong until we sent probes out past Mars in the 60s,
Really?
which debunked forever the idea of the existence of Martians and decreased the previous expectations of finding alien life in general.
yeah. Well, there's Martians, Venusians.
Mhm.
They all had inhabitants for a while.
Yeah, so that's kind of how it evolved from there's no alien life out there at all to what we kind of believe today for whether or not aliens can exist out there. But I always find it interesting, even today, when people are talking about alien sightings, they don't say grays. The most common thing you're going to hear, particularly from people who are skeptical, is little green men, correct?
Yes,
But that's not what people picture at all. Where the hell does that come from?
I think it is the how they were portrayed, how people have been portrayed as experiencing something with aliens, whether it be an abduction or a sighting. It was the spin that the media would put on it. I think something similar to how a flying saucer was coined. It was people saying, the little green men, because everybody says that sarcastically.
Well, yeah, but this idea has to come from
I guess
somewhere.
it would have had to come from somewhere.
Yeah. And this does actually have roots way back in the day. I don't actually
Oh, really?
I can't put a time on it because little green men was commonly used to describe various supernatural beings in old legends and folklore, fairy tales, and children's books. You got all of the supernatural beings in these books and all these stories are green, whether you're talking goblins or ogres or monsters. A lot of them are green beings. The idea of supernatural others
Interesting.
being green pretty much goes back to as far as our languages can.
I'm learning so much.
During flying saucer sightings in the 1950s, this term started to become associated with green men as popular usage in referencing aliens when it came to UFO sightings. And the use of little green men was already deeply ingrained in English at this time. It also seems to have easily extended beyond the imaginary to real people. So they would be used for actors like the little people in The Wizard of Oz. And even at some point, camouflaged Japanese soldiers were called little green men. So in 1947, when Kenneth Arnold sees these UFOs, it just kind of becomes the vernacular of this supernatural thing that people just used it as the modern equivalent.
Really?
Yeah. And in 1960 is really when this shifts. So little green men used vernacularly up until the 1960s, when stories that are coming out about interactions with the beings within the crafts start to come out. So that's, for the most part, like, this associations with little green men. So how do we end up with the idea of the Greys? Well, it's the late 1800s that we're going to start with, where science fiction writers start to talk about gray beings. There are a few around this time talking about it, but the most prominent is H.G. Wells, who wrote in 1893 in The Man of the Year Million. He writes what he projects humanity to evolve into, and basically just calls them gray-skinned beings with enlarged heads and eyes.
That's the first time?
There are a few right around that time, but he's the most prominent.
That's pretty cool.
H.G. Wells also talks about them in his book The Time Machine with the Morlocks, who are the highly evolved humans in the future. And then in 1933, there's a book by a man named Gustav Sandgren. It's called The Unknown Danger, and he writes this. It's about an extraterrestrial species. The creatures did not resemble any race of humans. They were shorter than the average Japanese, and their heads were big and bald with strong square foreheads and very small noses and mouths and weak chins. What was most extraordinary about them were the eyes, large, dark, gleaming with a sharp gaze. They wore clothes made of soft gray fabric, and their limbs seemed to be familiar to those of humans. So he's really talking about these big-headed creatures. And weirdly enough,
You picture a gray when he says that.
yeah, exactly. He describes it well, although he doesn't technically in that verse say that they're gray, but it is more or less what we would think here. And right around this time, strangely enough, Aleister Crowley is going to come up, because in 1917, he says that he communicates with this being known as Lam, L-A-M. Go Google a picture of what Lam looks like, both Chelsea and you listeners, when you have a chance.
I know exactly what Lamb looks like. He does look like a gray.
Yeah, he's right around these parameters. Now, you should also make note, this also looks exactly as what H.G. Wells described as a future human, so maybe he took inspiration when he was creating this picture. But Lam wasn't an alien. Crowley believed that Lam was a Tibetan Lama from Lung, between China and Tibet, and Lam is Tibetan for way or path, which Crowley said, Crowley, I'm saying it wrong, Crowley, said had the numerical value of 71, or no thing, a gateway to the void and a link between the stars, between systems of Sirius and Andromeda. And Lam was to fulfill the work initiated by Aiwass. And he drew this portrait of Lam that you hopefully have looked at, so you can see what we're talking about, because he doesn't really describe it, he just drew it. And said that gazing on the portrait enables one to make contact with this entity. There are still many people who say they make contact with Lam. It brings up implications, but we're just going to kind of skip over that and say that this is something that looks exactly like what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
From there, we're going to actually talk about the first people who come forward saying they had contact with Greys. And Chelsea, are you ready for it? It's Bill Moore. Just kidding. It's Barney and Betty Hill.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But in our last episode, I don't know if we're spoiling it.
We're not.
Okay.
Bill Moore comes up later on. Don't worry about it.
Bill Moore, no, it was, what's his face that we just had?
John Lear. John Lear said
John Lear.
that it at least came up in the John Lear episode that Bill Moore says he coined the term Greys, which he might have. It's very minute in this entire thing.
Yeah, well, whoever coined it, that like what they're calling them, I mean.
Yeah. So this idea of this character that we've been seeing through science fiction, or at least non-actual contact entities, really comes to fruition in 1965 when Betty and Barney Hill come forward with their story. So they are allegedly, we've covered this a long time ago and only part of it. So Betty and Barney Hill allegedly were abducted in 1961 by alien beings with grayish skin. They were in their car. They see these guys. They get taken onto the spacecraft.
I don't think we
Betty-
actually covered the abduction.
No, we never covered the actual abduction, and we're not going to cover it here either, other than the fact that Betty apparently gets shown this star map, and people have alleged that this looks like a map of Zeta Reticuli based on where the stars are. And you might sometimes
That's Zeta
see-
Reticuli if I ever saw it.
Yeah, exactly. You might see people refer to the Greys as Zeta Reticulans. So that's as far as we need to go with that part.
Can I just make a comment? Maybe I should hold my comment. Should I say it or should I hold it?
You can say it.
It seems like at this point there's enough kind of in the subconscious of popular culture at the time for this to come into fruition to something.
Yes, there definitely is, and that's going to be kind of the next portion of this episode.
Okay.
That this is kind of all over science fiction, and this is something that is on TV at the time.
Oh yeah, I
But-
guess it would be on TV. Even
Yeah.
if you're just kind of reading science, like I don't read a lot of science fiction, but there's things that you hear in passing and stuff like that for it to be something that is known, or at least in your subconscious.
I have speculation as to why, too, everything kind of works out the way it does from this point, based
Okay.
on the technology of the time. Anyhow, Barney and Betty Hill don't remember any of this. They have some missing time. They end up going to a hypnotist. When they go to the hypnotist, they each end up talking about these entities who abducted them. And hey, guess what? They end up kind of describing the same thing. They even draw up kind of a sketch of it. And it's a gray entity that has more facial features than we would be used to. Slightly smaller heads, but they're gray. And this is where the idea originally comes from for abductions with grays. And Chelsea, when I did some research on the Betty and Barney Hill case for this, I feel like we need to do an episode on Betty specifically because she has some interesting things she does later in life.
I think I know that, but yeah, I would love to do an episode
Yeah.
in which we actually talk about what happens and not just
Can we just allude to most of that? Sorry, let's not
Allude.
spoiler that episode in the future.
yeah, don't spoil it.
Sorry. Anyhow, it comes out, very famous case. It ends up going internationally famous. And pretty much most people would know, at least, if they're talking about aliens, this is the Betty and Barney Hill case, and
Mhm.
that they saw these gray aliens. Goes huge from there. I do want to make a note that there were ufologists that had looked at this, and way later on, in fact, it wasn't alleged until in 1990 in an article called Entirely Unpredisposed, Martin Kottmeyer suggested that Barney and Betty's memories, revealed under hypnosis, kind of really line up to an episode of The Outer Limits, which came out 2 weeks before their hypnosis. And Chelsea,
What?
I'm going to share my screen with you just so that you can see this.
Whose sketch is that?
This is Barney and Betty's Hill. The topmost sketch is Barney's, while the lower two were David Baker's based on Barney's description. So that's what they have. And
Wow.
this is the alien in The Outer Limits.
That's the same guy, pretty much.
Now, I do want to say that maybe the nicer sketches, that guy was influenced by the Outer Limits episode. Who knows?
Did
It's hard
they
to say
watch?
Barney.
The
I
Outer
don't know.
Limits is
Well, and that's
Canadian,
that whole thing.
is it not?
No, the redo was Canadian. It was an originally 1960s show. I don't know if that
Oh,
was
okay.
Canadian. But Barney wasn't a great artist, so
No.
his doesn't line up as much as the other guys. But the other guys do seem to line up pretty well. But again,
I mean, even looking at his, it looks very similar.
but it should be noted too that this was an allegation made 26 years after the abduction case happened and all this came out.
Mhm.
That allegation has never actually been made up until that point. But that also brings up, at least I didn't see it discussed too much, but this starts to get big in the 1960s, Chelsea. Do you know what wasn't big in the 1960s? Color TVs. So I'm wondering if the whole point, or at least one of the reasons that we end up with gray beings, is because of hypnotic regression to something that they saw on TV. This wasn't the only TV show at the
That's such a good
time.
point. You wouldn't know what to color it if it's something
Yeah.
that you saw on the Outer
Unless it's
Limits.
specifically stated.
in
But if
black
it's
and
shown
white.
in the background or something you weren't paying too much attention to, definitely gray.
I mean, if you're going under hypnosis and that's something in your subconscious, that's something that if your subconscious has nothing to put there, that it could pull from somewhere else to put something.
Yeah.
if you're not careful when you're hypnotizing somebody.
But yeah, I am really curious if anybody could do the research on that and see if that's kind of one of the things that could be a factor in the prominence of gray aliens. The fact that we didn't have color TV when it rose to prominence, but we did have TV.
That's a good point. And it could very well have... Did H.G. Wells say a color? I can't remember if you did say.
He also said that those were future humans. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
But
point.
That's just purely my speculation. I think it's valid and will hold
I
up.
think it is too. It's a really good point.
I have no research to back it up other than what we're talking about now. So the report from the regression features a scenario that was in some respects similar to the television show, and also it featured wraparound eyes, which are an extreme rarity in science fiction films. I know of only one instance they appeared on the alien of an episode of an old TV series, The Outer Limits, entitled The Bellero Shield. A person familiar with Barney's sketch in The Interrupted Journey, and the sketch done in the collaboration with the artist David Baker, will find deja vu creeping up his spine when seeing this episode. The resemblance is much abetted by an absence of ears, hair, and nose on both aliens. Could it be by chance? Consider this. Barney first described and drew the wraparound eyes during hypnosis session on February 22nd, 1964, and the Bellero Shield was first broadcast on February 10th, 1964. Only 12 days separate the two instances, and if the identification is admitted, the common sense of wraparound eyes in the abduction literature follows two cultural forces. So that's where we get kind of the shaping, and that's that theory that that's where the grays come from, is hypnotic regression bringing back a memory from something else.
Okay, I can get behind that.
There are a few other sightings or abductions during that time that mention grays, but we're going to kind of skip over that for now and go to 1977 when a young up-and-coming director by the name of Steven Spielberg is working on a movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And they design an alien which shows up in the film that looks strikingly similar to these grays that we're discussing. And it's really the first time you're going to see the grays as we talk about them come up. And Chelsea, I am just going to show you really quickly. This was the original design for what the aliens in Close Encounters of the Third Kind were going to look like.
I was just Googling it.
They had to change the eyes because apparently it was kids who had to wear them and it creeped them out too much. So they changed the eyes. But that's basically the gray alien that people picture.
That's him.
It should be noted then, well, how did Steven Spielberg come up with this? There's a book called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Ultimate Visual History by Michael Klaas-Doren, and he notes on pages 105 through 107 that the Close Encounters alien designs came from the film's scientific advisor, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who's actually in the movie near the end, who famously worked...
Oh, he is?
Yes. He famously worked on the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book. Here's a direct quote from this book. When designing the aliens, Spielberg and John Alves didn't set out to create wildly imaginative otherworldly beings. Instead, Spielberg was determined to keep the film as factual as possible, turning to the work of ufologist J. Allen Hynek as a starting point. In the majority of the credible reports Hynek had received regarding Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the description of the ETs were remarkably similar, and the beings often known as Greys were nearly always described as being pale and diminutive, with large bulbous heads and two huge almond-shaped eyes. That species was being reported all over the world, Spielberg said, and that made me think that there was some validity to the sightings. That's the story behind why the aliens are that way in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And this really pushes it into absolutely everybody's psyches. This was a huge movie at the time. And specifically, J. Allen Hynek used inspiration from cases that he worked on in Blue Book. Betty and Barney Hill were a Project Blue Book case, as was Lonnie Zamora. I can't remember if we've talked about the Zamora case, but it's from 1964. It also involves gray aliens. And these are kind of the two that he drew the most inspiration from for helping create this alien. The next thing that really brings gray aliens into the zeitgeist is Whitley Strieber's book Communion, specifically the cover of that book. Now, Communion was huge. It was a big book in the 80s. It should be importantly mentioned that although, is it fiction? It's fiction, right? He tells the story through fiction, but he says it's based on real events. But Whitley Strieber tells the story of gray aliens and contact with them. There's a cover of the book that is very famous, and basically it is what people picture when they picture gray aliens. aliens. This cover was done by a man by the name of Ted Seth Jacobs, and he kind of said this about it. It was painted in my small apartment on East 33rd Street in New York City. Whitley sat with me first for a drawing of the aliens. As I sketched, he would indicate how to change the portrait so that it would more match what he saw. It was, I believe, the process used by the police sketch artists, and every last detail was corrected according to his instructions. At one point, he said the image corresponded exactly to what he had seen. With Whitley beside me for the subsequent session, I began to paint the image on a wooden prepared panel, going through the same process as for the drawing, until Whitley finally said the image was exact. As to the gender of the alien image, to tell the truth, the subject didn't come up. I don't even know if the Greys have genders as we understand it. Whitley corrected the developing image to have a certain fragility, a vulnerability, and I suppose we Earthlings usually associate these qualities with femininity. So that's really where the two biggest things here of how we picture Greys. First comes from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and then the cover of Communion. These are literally where most things draw back.
Well, I know the thing with the cover of Communion was it caused a big stir because it caused so many people to recognize that they had to encounter this type of being. And so people recognized it that way. But playing devil's advocate here, if you're seeing this in popular culture, that could cause some sort of subconscious recognizing of it as well.
That's a fair point, yeah. Or just it's been in the back of your mind for a long time, yeah.
Yeah.
And especially here, it's kind of like the satanic panic of its time, which is right around this time as well, where people spontaneously created memories of like satanic rituals happening in their childhood, which never happened at all. So right around this time too is when Bill Moore hits the scene with his Roswell book in 1980. And this is where Bill Moore gets involved in this. Basically, he wrote this book and brought back the idea of Greys to the Roswell story. That's his addition to the Grey mythos. He might have coined the term Greys. I couldn't find any conclusive evidence one way or the other, but that's kind of where it comes.
That he did, that it was Greys?
That he came up with the term Greys. No idea if you have.
Oh, yeah. So as a reminder, we've talked about this so many times.
Yeah.
Bill Moore went in and wrote that story. What was it, like 20 years after Roswell actually happened?
Over 30, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where they said they recovered an alien body.
And specifically Greys.
Yeah, specifically like many, many, many years later.
And the 80s is really where most of this comes from, this idea of the Grey and where it hits cultural phenomenon, because 77 is when Close Encounters of the Third Kind comes out. Bill Moore writes his book in 1980. I believe Communion is the early 80s. I didn't put the specific date down. But the movie comes out with Christopher Walken in it, playing Whitley Strieber in 89. We get this redone story of Roswell where the Greys are there, and it just explodes.
I could see it happening like that. Actually, it all, damn it makes so much sense. Damn it.
And yeah, because of this story, I saw a poll, and it's like a weird stat. Greys are often involved in alien abduction claims. Among reports of alien encounters, Greys make up 50% in Australia, 73% in the US, 48% in continental Europe, and 12% in the UK. And these reports also include two distinct groups of Greys that differ in height. Like we talked about at the beginning, it should be noted, I couldn't find the original paper for this, where these numbers came from, but these statistics were collected at UFO conventions. So I don't think it's going to be the best evidence, to put it that way.
Wow.
I find this crazy that everything kind of stems from the early 60s here. And the first kind of inspired thing I could find from the stories of Greys is in 1966, a Japanese superhero named Ultraman comes out, who is explicitly based on the recounts of Grey aliens that were coming out. That's really the first thing that comes out. But from there, it's in everything. They're in Babylon 5, Stargate, South Park has it, X-Files, they definitely come up several times, and in many video games they show up too, and basically they're everywhere.
They have to be the most common extraterrestrial.
Oh yeah, for sure. Not the only one, and we could definitely do the history of different niche aliens that are out there, but these were the main list. This is the one I wanted to talk
about. Is the main one, yeah, and it kept coming up, so I was so excited to hear you're doing this episode.
That's kind of where it ends off, is it's everywhere in the zeitgeist, and that's where it all just kind of comes from.
We do episodes on here, and I go into it being like, yeah, this is going to be so amazing. I love this topic, and then we get to the end of it, and I'm like, damn it. Because I've said it a million times, like, I want to believe in this stuff. I love the paranormal. And then we do an episode. And I'm just convinced the other way. However, I'll say that with an asterisk on this one. I do think that it can be a real thing, but you can really, through everything that you
can see the trajectory of it.
You can see the trajectory, and you can see it start to be in the back of people's minds, starting with, which I think is really cool that H.G. Wells had. That's such a creative idea.
Yeah.
The future humans.
It is interesting, though, because he definitely also did space-based things in Aliens. So it's interesting that it only comes up as future humans and not the aliens, like War of the Worlds had aliens in it, and they go to Mars to fight back in the War of the Worlds.
That's true,
and it didn't come up in there.
H.G. Wells is most well known for War of the Worlds and causing the huge panic with War of the Worlds on the radio. Yeah. And so, being popular at the time, if people read any other of his works, sometimes things get mashed up into one the more time goes on. And then it just starts it just seems to start to snowball with everything in pop culture. And then with Betty and Barney Hill, that's where it's a point of coming into contact with the UFO people. And then it takes off from there.
It could just be the fact that they were the first external forces that we ended up seeing that end up associating with this H.G. Wells idea.
Yeah. Well, Outer Limits is also science fiction. So if you take one of those and perhaps he had also read H.G. Wells or something. Anyhow, it's in like the psyche of culture, and it just kind of goes, and then you get the fucking Whitley Strieber's in there and Bill Moore, who just starts fucking making shit up.
Yeah. And the Richard Doty's, who are really bad at making shit up, so they just take the things that are already there.
Yeah, and which you get the Ebens, who are probably also Greys.
Yeah, I looked them up. They weren't quite in the same parameters as the Greys. They are close, though.
He had a little bit of creativity on that one.
Yeah, they had more facial features. That's like the only difference.
That was so interesting. I didn't expect it was going to go there.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun actually looking this one up.
Yeah, I found that super interesting.
And thankfully, it wasn't one of those ones that I felt like there was nothing to the story, where it just kind of seems to appear one day. There seems to be a nice linear trail.
Oh, yes. You can see it happening. Yeah.
And with that
was amazing.
I have been Taylor, here with Chelsea. We are Journey to the Fringe. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Journey to the Fringe. If you have liked what you have listened to, please like, share, subscribe, or follow, depending on what venue you are listening to us through. Also, please, if possible, leave a 5-star review, as that really helps us in the algorithms. Should you wish to interact with us, please check us out on your social media of choice. I bet you we are there. And if you really want to communicate with us and give us ideas for new episodes, or tell us that we're wrong and terrible, either way, please send us an email at journeytothefringe@gmail.com. For now, I'll see you in the next episode.